There are men who act at once and men who wait. I have always been a man who waits, not from cowardice, and not from indifference, but from a conviction, held too long and too tightly, that the timing must be right before I can move. I waited through 3 seasons of bad weather before I repaired the south wall of Halstow Park. I waited 11 months before I dismissed the estate manager who had been stealing from the tenants. I waited, in one fashion or another, for 8 years before I told Verity Ash that I loved her, and by the time I told her, she already knew everything except that, which was perhaps the most important piece of all. I should begin at the beginning, though the beginning is harder to locate than you might think. There is a beginning I could give you, a specific moment, a specific room, a specific woman at a specific window, and that is where I will start. But the truth is that the beginning is earlier than that. The beginning is a Tuesday in November, 8 years before the storm, when I rode through the village of Penarth on my way back from the coast road, and saw a woman arguing with the landlord of a cottage over a figure that was written on a piece of paper he was holding, and her voice was perfectly controlled, and her logic was entirely correct, and he was wrong about every number and too proud to admit it, and she knew it, and she was managing the conversation with such precise, unyielding patience that I reined in my horse and sat there for perhaps 5 minutes, watching. She won. He corrected the figure. She thanked him with a courtesy that was so perfectly measured it was almost not quite, but almost a rebuke. She walked back to the cottage. She did not look at the road. She went inside. I rode on. I did not stop. I told myself it was none of my business, which was true. I told myself I had not noticed anything in particular, which was not. Her name, I discovered when I made inquiries of my estate steward the following week under the pretense of reviewing the Penarth tenancies, was Verity Ash. She had come to the village 4 years prior as governess to the Harwood children at the estate, a position that had lapsed when the family moved north, but she had stayed on, supplementing her income with village teaching and occasional manuscript work for a publisher in the nearest town. She rented the cottage from a man named Colby, who was the landlord I had watched her defeat on the numbers, and whose arithmetic, I noted when I reviewed the tenancy ledger, was as bad as she had indicated. She was 26. She had no family to speak of, a father gone early, a mother gone late, a small inheritance from the mother that had covered 2 years of comfortable living before being absorbed by the debts her father had left behind. She had worked since. She read extensively. The steward mentioned this with the baffled air of a man who finds reading in a woman slightly suspicious. And she had a cat and a garden and 4 students in the village whom she taught on Tuesday and Thursday afternoons for a modest fee. I found this out in the way that a man finds things out when he is a duke, quietly, through people whose job it was to know, without anyone understanding why he was asking. I have never been comfortable with the alternative, the direct inquiry, the introduced approach, the social occasion manufactured to create a meeting that feels accidental. I find pretense exhausting. I prefer to know what I'm doing before I do it. The difficulty with Verity Ash was that I did not know what I was doing. I knew what I had observed, a woman with a precise mind, a composed manner, and a quality of attention that was, in my experience of people, quite rare. I did not know what to do with this knowledge. I was 32 years old. I was the Duke of Halstow. I had managed a 15,000-acre estate since I was 23, settled 2 lawsuits, rebuilt the south wing after a chimney fire, and conducted every dimension of my professional and personal life with what I considered reasonable competence. I had not, in any of this, developed any particular facility for what I was trying not to call pursuit. So I did what I do with things I am not ready to address directly. I did what I could from where I stood. The Colby tenancy, I discovered, was overpriced by a margin that was not dramatic but was consistent. Colby had raised it twice in 4 years on the basis of no improvement to the property, which was a practice I found objectionable as a matter of principle, and somewhat more than that in this particular instance. I bought the tenancy. I reduced the rent to its correct value. I did this through the estate mechanism. The steward made the transaction, not me, and I gave no explanation beyond the standard review of Penarth Holdings, which was, in fact, overdue. I told myself this was estate management. It was not only estate management. Over the years that followed, I did other things. A teaching position opened at the Halstow Estate School, a position I had not known I needed to create until I found I needed to create it. The salary was reasonable. It was offered through the steward. She accepted. The publisher in the nearest town with whom she did manuscript work happened to supply the estate's small library, and I happened to mention, in a letter about an order of reference volumes, that I had heard they employed a reader, and that if she was available for additional work I would find it useful. She was available. She worked for 6 years on an irregular basis, 3 or 4 manuscripts a year, and never knew the letter had come from me. I sent her books. This is the part I find most difficult to account for and most honest to admit. I sent her books anonymously, through a London bookseller, with no card, because I had made inquiries of her reading habits from the publisher, and found that her own budget for books was, by necessity, small, and that she read everything she could acquire and wanted a great deal more. I selected them with care. I had, by then, read everything I sent, which was not exactly why I sent them but was not unrelated to it either. She was, I told myself, a tenant on my estate. It was reasonable to take an interest in tenants. It was reasonable to ensure that the cottage was maintained, that the positions she held were fairly compensated, that the work she did was valued appropriately. I told myself this for 8 years. I was not an idiot. I knew, by the 3rd year, what it was. But knowing something and acting on it are different operations, and I had not found the way to act, and I told myself there was time, and there was always something else that required managing first, and she was settled and apparently content, and I had no reason to disrupt that. Then the storm came. It was November again. It is always November at Halstow, in my memory, though logically there were other months. A storm off the channel, hard and cold, the kind that brings the cliff path to within 2 feet of nothing and makes the track from the village impassable. I had ridden out that morning to assess the south wall, which had taken damage the previous winter and which I had been intending to address all autumn. I rode back in the storm's leading edge, took the cliff path rather than the road shorter in fine weather, inadvisable in bad, and came off the horse on the wet rock. The horse was fine. I was not. This is not how I planned to close the distance. I was found by 2 of the estate's groundsmen who had come out to check the cliff fencing. They carried me to the nearest shelter, which was not the park. The park was a mile east, into the teeth of the storm, but the Penarth village lane, and specifically the cottage at the end of it. Verity Ash opened the door to 2 men carrying a third, and did not waste time on reactions. She asked what had happened, directed them to the sitting room, told them where to put me, sent the younger one for the village doctor, and told the older one to bring the blanket from the chest at the top of the stairs. I was conscious for most of this. I was not coherent. The doctor came, assessed, and told her I had a concussion and a broken rib and should not be moved until the storm broke. He did not know who I was. The groundsman, at my confused instruction, had not used my name, and I was not in condition to clarify or to think about why I had said it. The doctor left. The storm did not break. She managed me through the fever with the same efficiency she had managed Colby over the cottage figures, the same precise economy of motion, the same complete absence of panic. I was aware of her in the intermittent, fragmentary way of fever, a voice giving me water, a hand adjusting the blanket, a lamp moved further from my eyes because I had flinched at it. I have no record of saying anything coherent during this period and remain in some suspense about what I might have said incoherently. When the fever broke, 3 days, she told me later, I was in the sitting room, on the good sofa, under 3 blankets, with the fire well up and a cat on my feet that I had not seen arrive and could not account for. She was at the desk across the room, reading a manuscript. She did not look up immediately when I stirred. "Good," she said without looking up. "I'll get you something to eat." She brought soup. She sat in the chair opposite while I drank it, with the manuscript on her knee, reading. She was not performing attention. She was not watching me with the concentrated care of a nurse enjoying her vigilance. She was simply present and competent, and doing two things at once, which I later understood was her ordinary register. I said, "Thank you." She said, "Of course. It's lucky the groundsman brought you this way rather than trying the road." "Yes." She turned a page. The cat adjusted itself on my feet. I said, "I haven't given you my name." "No," she said, "you haven't." "Does that not concern you?" She looked up. She had gray eyes and a direct gaze and the expression of someone who has thought about something before speaking, not to delay, but because they consider it accurate to be certain first. "A man brought to my door in a storm by the estate's own groundsman is unlikely to be a serious danger," she said. "You're welcome to give me your name when you're inclined to. I'm Miss Ash." I did not give her my name. I know how this sounds. But I was in her sitting room on her sofa with 3 of her blankets, eating her soup, and I had spent 8 years not quite managing to come to her door, and here I was behind it. Here I had arrived, through a set of circumstances that I had not planned and could not quite believe, and I wanted, for a few more days, before everything shifted into its correct and inevitable shape, to be simply a man with a broken rib who was recovering in a warm room, not a duke. Not the owner of the cottage she lived in, not the person who had been sending her books for 8 years. Just this, just the fire and the cat and the manuscript on her knee. She did not press. She brought me soup, and then bread, and then on the 3rd day a proper meal at the table which she sat across and ate herself in a comfortable silence that required no management from either of us. She had found, she told me, a book in my coat pocket, a natural history of the coastal formations, quite technical, and she asked if she might look at it while I slept. I said yes. She had read the first 100 pages by the time I woke. "You've marked the margins," she said when I was awake. "Yes." "In a very small hand. It's quite dense, the marginalia. You've been working with this for a while." "A few years." She looked at the page she was on. "A structural contradiction, noted in section 3, see also Whitmore's analysis vol. II, which reaches the same formation by a different method. You've read Whitmore." "Yes." She set the book down. "So have I. I thought I was the only person in Penarth who had." I said, "What did you make of his argument in the 4th volume?" She made quite a lot of it, as it turned out. We talked for an hour and a half about Whitmore's 4th volume, and then about 3 other books we had both read, and then about a 4th that she had read and I had not, which she described with such precise enthusiasm that I made a mental note of the title and the author and the specific chapter she found most valuable, and I had ordered it from London before I had been back at the park 3 days. This is what I mean when I say I was not ready to close the distance. I was already in it. I had been in it for 8 years. I simply had not found the door, and the storm found it for me. On the 5th day she found the ring. I had been well enough to sit up, to move carefully about the cottage, to help with small things, the fire, the water, a shelf that had been slightly loose for some time, and which I fixed with tools from the cottage's small shed. She thanked me for the shelf with a dryness that told me she had noticed it herself months ago and had simply not gotten to it. We were comfortable. It was a specific kind of comfortable that I recognized, from the outside, as something I had wanted for a very long time without knowing exactly what shape it would take. She was clearing my coat, which had been put over the chair by the fire to dry, and which was dry now, and which she was returning to me with the practical efficiency of someone finishing a task, when the pocket turned out as she folded it, and the ring came with it. It is not a subtle ring. It is a signet ring, gold with the Halstow crest, and it is the kind of ring that announces itself immediately to anyone who knows what to look for. And Verity Ash, who had lived on the Halstow estate for 8 years and worked for the Halstow Estate Library and taught at the Halstow Estate School, knew exactly what to look for. She looked at it for a long moment. She looked at me. I said nothing. She said, "You're the Duke." I said, "Yes." She set the ring on the table between us. She set the coat over the back of the chair with the same quiet precision. She sat down in the chair opposite, folded her hands in her lap, and looked at me with the expression of a woman who is processing a very large piece of information with great care, and who is not going to say anything until she has processed it completely. I waited. I was very good at waiting. I was perhaps too good at it. She said, "How long have you owned the cottage I live in?" 8 years. She said nothing. "The rent was corrected when I bought the tenancy," I said. "The previous landlord." "I know the rent was corrected," she said. "I thought it was an error in my favor. I didn't question it." She looked at the ring. "The school position." "Yes." "The manuscript work." "Through the publisher." "Yes." She was very still. "The books," she said. I said nothing, which was the answer. "Someone has been sending me books," she said, "for since I arrived here, a London bookseller, no card, always exactly what I wanted to read next, which I could never account for because I never told anyone what I was reading." She looked up. "You told the publisher." "I asked about your reading habits in a letter about a library order." "Yes." She looked at me for a long time. 8 years, she said. "Yes." "You have been arranging things for 8 years without telling me." "Yes." She went to the window. She stood there for what I calculated at slightly under 3 minutes, looking out at the cliff path and the gray sea beyond, and I did not speak because I have always known that a woman like Verity Ash does not require management in this moment. She requires time and silence, and she will come back from the window when she has thought it through, and what she says then will be worth waiting for. She came back from the window. She said I should be angry. "Yes," I said, "I think you have the right." "I am not," she said slowly, "not angry, but I need you to explain it, all of it, from the beginning. Why you watched and didn't come, and what you wanted, and why it was easier to send books than to knock on a door." I said, "That is a fair question." "It's the only question," she said. I told her all of it, the Tuesday in November with Colby and the figures, the inquiry through the steward, the tenancy, the position, the publisher, the books. I told it plainly, without softening it, because she was not the kind of woman who is served by softening, and I had spent 8 years understanding her well enough to know that much. I told her that I had known by the 3rd year what it was. I told her I had not found a way to act on it that did not feel presumptuous. A duke arriving at a governess's door with no introduction and no occasion and no purpose that could be honestly described, without saying the thing I had not yet permitted myself to say. She listened without interrupting. When I finished, she was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "You thought arriving at my door was presumptuous." "Yes." "But sending books for 8 years was not." I said, "In retrospect." She looked at me. Something crossed her face, not quite a smile, not quite exasperation, something between and more interesting than either. "Your Grace," she said, "you have managed every dimension of my life in this village for 8 years. You have managed it well and honestly and with the rent correctly figured, and for those things I am genuinely grateful. But you have also been watching me for 8 years without once introducing yourself, which is a thing that, if I had known it, I would have found quite strange." "Yes," I said, "I know. And you find it easier to tell me this now, because the storm brought you here, and you couldn't manage any other approach." "Yes," I said, "that is accurate." She said, "What did you want, in the beginning, when you first asked about me. I said I don't think I knew. And now, I looked at her. She was standing in the middle of her sitting room, my cottage, which was her home, with her hands at her sides and her gray eyes direct, and her expression the particular quality of a person who will not accept a vague answer, and is patient enough to wait for the right one. I said, I want to stop watching from a distance. She was quiet. I said, I want the conversation we had about Whitmore every day. I want to fix the shelves myself rather than sending someone. I want to know which chapter you found most valuable and why, and what you think about the thing you are reading now, and what you want to read next, not so I can send it without a card, but so I can hand it to you and see your face when you read the first page. I stopped. I have been very stupid about this. She said, yes. I know. You have also, she said, with the precision she brought to all things, been very kind, unobjectionable in every practical dimension, which makes it quite difficult to simply be angry at you, which I suspect is something you counted on. I said I did not count on anything. I was not strategic. I was simply at a loss. She looked at me for a long time. I need to think, she said. I need a day. You should go back to the park. The storm is done. You're well enough. Yes, I said. And you should know, she said at the door, that the books they were exactly right. Every one of them. That is not a small thing. I rode back to the park. I managed the South Wall assessment. I reviewed the estate accounts for November. I wrote 2 letters that required writing. I did not send for her. I did not go back to the village. I waited. I was very good at waiting. She came to the park on the 3rd day. She came in the morning, which was characteristic. She did not delay things she had decided on. She was shown to the library where I happened to be, which is the room at Halstow that faces the sea. She stood in the doorway and looked at the room, the shelves, the hundreds of volumes, the reading table with its current stack, and her expression was the one I had first seen at Colby's door, precise, cataloging, managing her own response before she gave it. She came into the room. She went to the nearest shelf. She ran her finger along the spines, reading titles, stopping at one she recognized and pulling it out. I have this one, she said. I know, I said. You have had it for 4 years. I sent it in October of the year you arrived at the school. She opened it. She looked at the title page. She turned to the first chapter. She turned to the margins. She looked up. You wrote in it, she said, before you sent it. Yes. She read the margin note, a long one in my small hand, commenting on the author's 3rd argument. She turned 3 more pages, another note, another. She read them for what felt like a long time. Then she looked up and said, You sent me a conversation. I said yes. She was quiet. She held the book in both hands, looking at the cover, and I watched her face change through something. Something I could not fully read, but that I knew, by some instinct earned across 8 years, was significant. She said, There are other books. Yes, I said, all of them, every one I sent you. She looked at the shelves. There were perhaps 40 books I had marked and sent, not all together, not obviously, but they were there, interspersed among the thousands. I had not moved them or arranged them. I had simply read them and sent them and kept my own copies, and here they were, and here she was, and the distance between us was the width of the reading table and 8 years of marginal notes. She set the book down on the table. She pulled out another. I knew which one before she touched it, because I knew the shelf and the position, and opened it to the first margin note, which I had written when I was 32 years old and had just finished reading the book for the first time. She read it. She turned to the next. She was quiet for a long time. Then she said, You have been talking to me for 8 years. I said yes. In books. It was the only way yes. She closed the book and set it beside the first one, and looked at me across the reading table and said, Edmund. It was the first time she had used my name. She had not yet been given my Christian name. She knew the title, she knew the surname, and she had used neither, but she used it now, having found it somewhere, perhaps in the estate accounts, perhaps in the margin notes, where I had signed two of them with my initials. I said yes. She said, "Come here." I came. I walked around the reading table and stood in front of her, and she looked at me with the same direct, careful, cataloging attention she had given the books, as though she was reading me the same way, making sure she had understood the text before she said anything about it. Then she said, "You are going to have to stop managing things from a distance. If this is what I think it is, if you want what you said you wanted, you are going to have to be present, directly. Without the steward or the publisher or the bookseller." I said, "I know. I mean it." "I know that too," I said. "I have known it for 8 years. I simply couldn't find the door." She said, "You found it." "The storm." "The storm didn't find the door," she said. "You were already here. You've been here for 8 years." She looked at me steadily. "The storm just made you stop waiting." I said nothing. I had nothing to say that was more accurate than that. She said, "I want to read all of them. The ones you marked, all 40 or however many there are. I want to read what you thought and when you thought it and what you were trying to, what you were saying." She paused. "Will you let me do that?" "Yes," I said. "Of course." And then she said, "We can talk." We talked every day for 3 weeks. She came to the park in the mornings and we sat at the reading table and went through the books, not all of them, not consecutively, but in the order she chose, pulling one and then another, reading margin notes aloud, asking questions, disagreeing with me on 2 of them and being right on one and close on the other. I had the notes from the other direction, the notes she had made in her own copies, which she brought on the 4th day when she realized the conversation required them. We compared margins. We read each other's thinking across 8 years and found, in several places, that we had arrived at the same conclusion from opposite directions, which she found satisfying in the way that a precise mind finds patterns satisfying. On the 19th day she came in and found me at the desk, writing, and she did not interrupt but sat at the reading table with the book she had brought and read for an hour, and we were simply in the same room, quietly, which is not a thing that requires description, but is perhaps the most significant thing of all. At the end of the hour she said, "You know what I have decided." I looked up. "I think you have known for several days," she said, "but you were waiting." "Yes." "Edmund," she said, "you can stop." I set down the pen. I stood. I walked to the table and I sat across from her, where I had sat every day for 3 weeks, across the stacked books and the 2 sets of margins and 8 years of conversation that had been going on without her knowledge, and I said, "Verity." She said, "Yes." I said, "I would like to stop watching from a distance." She said, "I know, I'm telling you to." "I mean permanently." "I know what you mean," she said, with the dry patience she brought to everything I was slow to say. "I have read 8 years of your margin notes. I know what you mean." And I said. She looked at me across the table. Her gray eyes were steady and direct and warm in the way that I had seen, from a distance, for 8 years, and now, finally, from close. She said, "And yes. Obviously." Obviously, as though it were the most straightforward conclusion in the world. As though 8 years of books and margins and managed distances had arrived at the only logical ending. As though love, when it has been thorough enough and patient enough and honest enough in its own quiet way, simply resolves. I had spent 8 years learning to wait. What I had not understood was that the waiting had already done its work. She had read everything I had to say. She knew exactly what I was because I had been telling her, page by page, for longer than either of us had consciously understood. She knew she had decided. She was looking at me across the reading table in the library that faces the sea, and she said yes, obviously, and I know, it was the most precisely correct thing anyone has ever said to me. We were engaged before the winter was out. We were married in spring in the village church at Penarth, which is small and old and has a window that faces the sea. The cottage passed to a young couple from the village. I reduced the rent further because I could, and because 8 years of correct management had left it in excellent condition. The estate school kept its teacher, who was now the Duchess of Halstow and who taught on Tuesday and Thursday afternoons by her own choice and no one else's. The south wall was repaired that spring as well, finally, which was a relief on a separate account entirely. The reading table in the library has 2 chairs now. There are 2 sets of margin notes in the books, some hers, some mine, some in the books we have read together since, both. She has strong opinions about the arrangement of the shelves, and I have strong opinions about the arrangement of the shelves, and we have arrived, through a process that I would describe as negotiated, and she would describe as her simply being correct, at an arrangement that is better than either of us would have managed alone. On the shelf nearest the window, the shelf that faces the sea, she has arranged, together, the 43 books I sent her, my copies. She brought her copies as well, and they sit on the adjacent shelf. And if you stand between them, you can look from one set of margins to the other and read, in 2 distinct small hands, 8 years of thinking that was always about the same things and never quite managed to say so. She found that arrangement herself. She did not tell me she was doing it. I came into the library one morning and it was done, and she was at the reading table, and she did not look up, but she said, "I thought they should be together." I stood there looking at the shelves for a moment. She said, "Also, the order I've put them in is chronological by when you sent them, which I worked out from the postmarks I saved." Yes, I saved them. I always save correspondence, even from booksellers, and if you want to object to the order you may, but I think it's correct. I said, "It's correct." "Good," she said, and turned a page. I went to the chair across from her. I sat down. I opened the book I had been reading. Outside, the sea moved in its long gray swells along the Halstow cliff, and the November light came in the window that faces it, and we were together in the room we were always going to end up in, and there was nothing left to wait for, and nothing I had sent without a card that she did not now know, and nothing between us that required any more distance at all.